Hello, my name is Shawn Hawkins. I'm an associate professor in the Biosystems Engineering and Soil Science Department as part of the University of Tennessee Institute for Agriculture. As part of the virtual 2021 Tennessee Grain Conference, I'll be presenting data today and a presentation entitled Poultry Litter for Grain Production. My presentation today can be broken down into two parts with different goals. In part one, the goal is really to introduce grain producers to poultry production, and in particular to focus on what's important aspects of Tennessee poultry production. We'll talk a little bit about layer, pullet, breeder, and broiler housing and how that produces different manure types. We'll be focusing on broiler litter, which is most important in our state. And we'll talk a little bit about the characteristics of broiler litter for use as a fertilizer. And then for added perspective on the scale of the poultry industry and how it's important to grain producers, I'm going to be comparing three different things for Northwest Tennessee in particular. That would be grain production versus the poultry feed grain demand. That's for corn and soybeans. Second would be the nitrogen demand to produce corn compared with the litter nitrogen supply. And finally, the corn and soybean phosphorus and potassium removal rates for harvest. And we'll compare that with the litter phosphorus and potassium in the supply of litter that's produced in different regions of Tennessee, particularly in Northwest Tennessee and South Central Tennessee. In part two of our presentation, we'll basically review litter agronomics and recommendations to produce corn and soybeans in rotation with broiler litter. Fertilizing corn in particular, we'll discuss nitrogen fertilization rates and specific considerations when you're using broiler litter as a corn fertilizer. And then we'll talk about phosphorus and potassium removal rates and mineral removal rates for both corn and soybeans. And we'll talk a little bit about the early research that we've collected on carryover nitrogen that might benefit soybean production. Getting started, part one, a primer for poultry production, different types of housing and the housing that is important in Tennessee, and the relative scale of production. There are basically three types of poultry farms in the United States. The first type of farm is a layer farm. These are commercial farms that produce table eggs that are directly consumed and that are unfertilized. We don't have any of these farms in Tennessee, so we won't discuss the waste from those farms or how those farms are operated. We do have two other types of poultry operations, those devoted to the primary breeder industry and to the broiler industry. The primary breeder industry is devoted to producing meat chicken, or what we refer to as broiler male and female genetic lines. Broilers are crossbred birds. So this sector of the poultry industry is devoted to increasing the numbers of the breeding stock so that the birds can be crossbred in mass. These breeds of birds, the genetics are owned by two companies primarily, both with both pedigree and what we'll learn as GGP and GP farms in Tennessee. That's Aviagen and Cobb Vantris. The pedigree farms are owned directly by these companies where they develop and maintain the genetic lines. If we can imagine the primary breeder in the broiler industry as a pyramid, at the very top, the fewest birds of the highest value are the pedigree farms, and below that are the great-grandparent and the grandparent lines for the broiler industry. So the primary breeders do contract with private farms to produce the grandparent and the great-grandparent stock for these breeder lines, and we do have quite a few of these farms in Tennessee. However, there's not nearly as many of these farms as there are farms devoted to the broiler industry. And if you can get litter from these farms, you won't be able to go to the farm and pick up the litter because these are biosecure farms. So the vast majority of the litter is going to be associated with the broiler industry and not the primary breeder industry, although we do have both of the primary breeders responsible for 90% of the world's genetics here in Tennessee. So the third type and the most important are broiler farms. These are integrated private farms. By integrated, we mean that private farms produce under contract birds in successive flocks for contracts that these companies maintain with different companies such as Chick-fil-A or Kroger, for example, for meat supply. They're integrated in the sense that the birds are provided by these companies. The hatchery is part of the company complex, and of course the company complex provides feed. Examples of these companies are Tyson Foods, Cook Foods, and Pilgrim's Pride. And there are three different types of farms devoted to producing broilers. There are the pullet farms. These are farms that are raising birds that are bought from the primary breeders to produce hens. Hens are the vast majority of the birds that are present at the broiler breeder farms. The broiler breeder farms are those farms that produce the final eggs that are hatched to produce the broilers. There is some waste available for grain producers to use from broiler breeder farms, but in my estimates, only about 10% of the total poultry waste that's produced in Tennessee is from breeder farms. What is far, far more important are the broiler farms. There are many, many more of these farms and many more of these types of birds that are produced in Tennessee. And these are the birds that are grown and eventually go to the processing plants for the integrators such as Tyson Foods and Cook Foods and Pilgrim's Pride, where the birds are slaughtered and then sold for meat, either as a part of the fast food industry, for example, or as tray packs, for example, for grocery stores. Continuing with our introduction to the poultry industry in Tennessee, I've got a map here that shows where integrated broiler companies and primary breeders are located in our state. And one thing to understand is that, particularly for the broiler companies, most of the poultry manure, the litter, in other words, is going to be available within about a 35 or 40 mile radius of the location of these processing plants, because the processing plants themselves are sort of like the sun at the center of the solar system, and then they're surrounded by broiler breeder and pullet and broiler farms that are used to produce meat chickens that are obviously processed at their plants, so to keep transportation costs reasonable for both the feed and the birds themselves. Most of the waste is going to be available within about a 40-mile radius of these locations, and I'll point them out. This is Tyson Humboldt, a new facility that's under construction. This here is a Tyson facility that's present in Obion County, Tennessee, in Union City. This is a Tyson facility in Shelbyville in Bedford County. And then we have two facilities that are present in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Cook's Foods and Pilgrim's Pride both have processing plants in Chattanooga. And then in addition, there's a debone plant with some housing feeding into the debone and processing plants that exist in Hamlin County and Morristown. We do have producers that grow in Tennessee for a processing plant in Kentucky. That's Tyson in Albany, Kentucky, and we have a few farms that are integrated with Pilgrim's Pride in Mayfield, Kentucky. So the vast majority of the litter that's going to be available to produce grain is present, really, in my mind, and what's relevant to our talk today, in two regions in Tennessee that are notable for grain production. And that is in Northwest Tennessee and South Central Tennessee. In this slide, I'd like to show what a broiler breeder farm looks like, and the reason I'm doing this is, number one, to just give grain producers some insight into how the broiler industry works in our state, but also to emphasize that there are differences in the waste that comes from poultry farms. In this case here, we have a broiler breeder farm, and you can see that there are slats, raised areas on the left and right hand side of this long narrow barn. And along these slats, there's a series of nest boxes that you see here. And these nest boxes are where the hens lay eggs, and there's a conveyor under it, and those collect the eggs for transport to the hatchery. Much of the feed and water is present in the in this raised slat area, and the manure from these birds accumulates underneath these slats. So if a grain producer does have access to broiler breeder waste, one thing to keep in mind is that this waste will typically be a higher portion of manure proper without bedding added. And you can see that there is a central scratch area here in this broiler breeder house, but the vast majority of the waste is going to be characterized by the manure that accumulates underneath these slats. So this is one reason that you need to ask for a nutrient analysis if you're purchasing poultry manure, because if it comes from a breeder farm, the nutrient content does tend to be higher. In this slide here, we have a photograph of a broiler farm, and you can see that in a broiler farm there are no slats present in the barns. The birds are simply raised on a floor, and you can see that there's feed and water lines that run down the length of the buildings, and the birds are placed directly on what's referred to as litter. Litter is bedding material, particularly when the chicks are set. There's fresh bedding that's added that could be, for example, rice hulls or wood shavings. They're placed directly on this material, and the litter that's available for use by grain farmers as a row crop nutrient source is the material that accumulates in these barns. That would be the waste from the birds, as well as the soiled bedding and any spilled feed that might be present. So this is going to be a very different type of waste than the broiler breeder farm waste, and the vast majority of the poultry waste in the state is going to be broiler litter from these broiler farms that are used to produce meat chickens. Now that we've established that the vast majority of the poultry waste in Tennessee that's available for use by grain farmers is broiler litter, I'd like to talk a little bit about a typical analysis for this material as a fertilizer. Typically it tests as a 3-3-3 fertilizer, meaning that it contains approximately 60 pounds of nitrogen, P2O5 and K2O per ton as is meaning that the moisture content is not necessarily specified. I would advise, although this is a general recommendation, and typically the analysis is fairly similar to the numbers that I'm reporting here, I do recommend that grain producers that are seeking to use broiler litter as a fertilizer ask for an analysis, because broilers are raised successively in flocks, and the management of the litter between flocks varies from farm to farm, and that can affect the analysis. So it's always a good practice for you to ask for a representative analysis of what you're purchasing at the time that you purchase it. The key defining characteristic of broiler litter that most grain producers need to immediately acknowledge is that the nitrogen that's present here is largely organic, and it's in a slow release form. So the vast majority of the nitrogen, the total nitrogen that's present, is going to be organic nitrogen, and that nitrogen has to be broken down in the soil to be made available, plant available, and that takes time. Typically only about 45% of the nitrogen in broiler litter is going to be available for crop production in the year of application. So of that 60 pounds of nitrogen that's reported, somewhere around 25 to 30 pounds typically is what's going to be available. In the case of the potassium and the phosphorus, it's safe to assume that long term, especially all of the phosphorus and potassium will be 100% crop available. To really understand the scale and impact of the poultry industry in Tennessee, I'd like to take a few minutes and review for Northwest Tennessee, this region of Tennessee, the grain production in this area, this vital area for grain production in our state, versus the poultry feed demand that will be present once both the Humboldt facility is finished and the upgrade, the the increase in plant capacity at Union City is fully realized in this year or in 2022. You can see that I've got here for the host county region where the vast majority of these broiler farms are going to be located. That'd be O'Brien, Gibson, Weakley, Dyer, Carroll, Crockett, Henry, and Madison County. I've combined the corn and soybean production in terms of million bushels per year that was produced in 2019. That'd be 74 million bushels for corn and 27 million bushels for soybean. And I'm comparing it here with the feed requirement for the broiler, the pullet, and the breeder farms for these two processing facilities. And you can see that the demand for corn, which is approximately 65% of the content of poultry feed, represents around 32% of the production in the host county. So this is a very significant demand on grain production in our state. And in the case of soybeans at 9 million bushels per year, about 33% of the production for these host counties. Continuing with this analysis for Northwest Tennessee, in this overhead I'm presenting the corn demand for nitrogen in million pounds per year for corn in the host counties. This was computed based on 2019 production for corn and assuming 210 pounds of nitrogen per acre is required for the total acreage that was harvested. That's approximately 87 million bushels, 87 million pounds of nitrogen per year. And the best I can figure, somewhere around 200,000 tons of litter are eventually going to be available in Northwest Tennessee in these counties to produce corn grain. And you can see that that represents about 5.4 million pounds of nitrogen. That's assuming 45% of the total nitrogen that's available, or 6% of the corn demand for nitrogen in the host counties. This represents a significant value for the local economy. At 35 cents a unit, that would be approximately $2 million worth of nitrogen that's produced in broiler litter. And finally, for Northwest Tennessee, for added perspective, I'm comparing here the grain, phosphorus, and potassium removal, that'd be in corn and soybeans, against the supply for phosphorus and potassium within that approximate 200,000 tons of broiler litter that will be produced for these complexes in Union City and Humboldt. In terms of the grain removal here, basically what I've done is taken the 2019 production for corn and soybeans. I've assumed yields that were equivalent to the state average yields, 177 bushels of corn and 47 bushels of soybeans. And I've used Plant Nutrient Institute concentration estimates for the phosphorus and potassium in the grain. And I'm estimating here the number of pounds of phosphorus and potassium that are removed in corn and soybean grain in West Tennessee in these host counties here. You can see it would be 44 million pounds of P2O5 and 49 million pounds of K2O in total for both soybeans and corn. If we look at the litter supply, that's going to be approximately 12 million pounds of each of these nutrients. This is a significant supply of these plant nutrients for grain production potentially. It represents 47% of the removal of phosphorus in corn grain, 65% in the case of soybeans, and 27% in the case of the total grain removal for both soybeans and corn, and an estimated value at 35 cents a unit of approximately $4 million. In the case of potassium, it'd be 25% of the total grain removal can be replaced with broiler litter, and the value is again somewhere around approximately $4 million that would be added to the local economy. And it's likely that these nutrients, along with the nitrogen that was discussed in the prior slide, could be purchased at a reduced cost versus commercial fertilizers. I'd like to transition to the second part of the presentation today, which is mainly applied research data. We currently have two projects that are funded by the Soybean Promotion Board and also Tyson Foods. And we'll be discussing the intent of those two projects, which together look at broiler litter fertilization of corn litter and corn in rotation with soybeans. So we'll be looking at some early research data from this project, and also some recommendations for using broiler litter as a fertilizer for corn and soybean in rotation. Very briefly, I'd like to cover the applied research design for the data that I'm going to present today. We had 2 test farms. Each farm between 2019 and 2020, there were 2 plot locations established per farm, and each of those plot locations will be in a corn and soybean rotation. The first plot location at each farm was established in 2019 in corn, and the second location was established in 2020 in corn. The first location that was established in 2019 was rotated to soybeans for 2020. The idea being that we can collect more data if we have corn and soybeans alternately being produced in the plot areas each year at 2 sites. For the corn, we used 6 treatments and 4 replicates per treatment. We applied litter at 2, 3, 4, and then 5 or 7 tons an acre. The 5 ton per acre rate was used at Spring Hill, where the yield potential was slightly lower than it was at Milan, 7 tons an acre being used at Milan. We had a positive control treatment that received P and K per soil test, and then split application of either 180 or 210 pounds of nitrogen per acre. The 180 pounds of nitrogen was applied at Spring Hill, and the 210 pounds of nitrogen was applied at Milan. We did have a negative control that received P and K per soil test, but did not receive nitrogen fertilizer. For the subsequent soybean plot, we did not apply additional litter. For the litter plots, and for the positive and negative control, we did fertilize those with phosphorus and potassium per soil test. To emphasize how the nitrogen was replaced, we have an overhead here that covers our UT extension recommendation to split nitrogen applications for high yielding corn crops. We recommend that 1/3 of the total that's going to be applied at planting. And I have a plot here that shows the nitrogen uptake for corn through the various growth stages that's emphasized down here on this X scale. And this is just growing degree days here. This is an advantageous scenario for using litter as a fertilizer because there's low nitrogen demand up to the V4 to V6 growth stage, which would be right here. You can see that the nitrogen accumulation is quite low at this point right here. So there's low risk if you're using an organic nitrogen source where there's some risk associated with the availability factor. Remember, we said nitrogen was 45% available in poultry litter, but truthfully that does vary, and it can be low in some years, perhaps as low as 20%, and then in some years it can be very high as perhaps 75%. And that's where the pre-sidedress nitrate test comes in handy, that we'll be speaking about shortly. 2/3 is applied at V6. The split application obviously lowers the risk associated with a very large application of nitrogen fertilizer at planting. There could be significant losses, for example, with high rainfall rates following planting. So there is high demand for the corn subsequent to growth stage V6, and for this reason we would obviously not want to include an organic fertilizer that has to be broken down in the soil, and that could impact yield obviously when the nitrogen demand is very high. So there is high nitrogen availability risk. So obviously when we're using litter as a fertilizer, it would appear that using it as part of the split that is applied at planting, would be the wise way to go. This overhead begins our applied research data that we've been collecting over the last couple of years. We do have 2 test sites, but in the interest of time, I'm only going to be showing the results for Milan. This shows the myelin corn grain yield in 2019, at which time we established our first research plot location, Site A, and 2020 plot location, Site B. And you can see on the left, the y-axis is the corn grain yield between 0 and 300 pounds, or excuse me, 300 bushels per acre. And we have our treatment spread across the y-axis, the negative, positive control, and then different litter application rates of 2, 3, 4, and 7 tons an acre. One of the things that really stands out about this plot is this application rate at 7 tons an acre here. The amount of total nitrogen that was applied with this treatment is roughly equivalent to the amount of nitrogen that was applied with the positive control. And you can see yet there is a significant difference in the yield between these two plots. This emphasizes the point that we were making earlier, that only part of the nitrogen that's applied with poultry litter is going to become crop available. That makes it virtually impossible to produce a corn crop using only litter as fertilizer. And we did see these results repeated both in 2019 and then again at a different site location in 2020. Again, just emphasizing the fact that not all of the nitrogen in litter will be crop available in the year that the litter is land applied. As I mentioned earlier, the University of Tennessee does have a calibrated pre-side dress nitrate test for corn. This is a 12-inch soil sample. That is, we recommend that you collect that soil sample at V4, in which case you have enough time to get the analysis done and the split application of nitrogen complete at V6. You can see here we did pull these soil tests for 2019 at myelin, and clearly we can see one of the things that's driving the decreased yield for the litter plots is a lack of nitrogen availability. For the positive control, we have a good accounting for the commercial nitrogen fertilizer that we applied at planting. Remember, these numbers here only reflect the amount of fertilizer that was applied at planting and not split, because the samples were collected at V4. So we have a good accounting of the nitrogen that was made available for the positive control, but you can see that we have a poor accounting of nitrogen in the litter applications, even at the high litter application rates. Again, this is an indication that the organic nitrogen in the litter has not been released at this point. To give context to this graph, we do have our recommendations shown here on the graph. So depending on where your soil nitrate test comes out, we have different recommendations here for the amount of additional nitrogen that you should apply at V6. So this is a very useful tool if you are going to be using litter to produce corn grain. As confirmation of the information that was shown in the previous slide, we did collect ear leaf samples from the corn that was grown in 2019 at myelin, and that was fertilized with different rates of litter. And you can see that we have plotted here on one scale over here on the left, the y-axis, the amount of nitrogen that's present in the ear leaves, which is an indicator of the nitrogen fertilizer application sufficiency. And you can see that clearly for the positive control, as we expected, we have high corn ear leaf nitrogen concentrations that are in the sufficient range, but for even our high application rates of litter, our corn ear leaf nitrogen concentrations are in the deficient range. So this is again another indication of the fact that litter cannot provide all of the nitrogen that's required, particularly for a high yielding corn crop. These plots show the soybean yield for the plots that were transitioned from corn to soybean in 2020. Again, corn was produced on these plots in 2019, and then at plot site A for each of our sites, both myelin and Spring Hill, we transitioned these to soybeans in 2020, and you can see that we had very good yields across the board for all of the treatments, both the prior year litter applications as well as the positive and negative controls that were used in this year. You see no depression in yield, for example, without the use of commercial P and K and with the use of litter on these plots. So we did get equivalent yields for all of the treatments, including those that received litter in the prior year without the addition of commercial phosphorus and potassium fertilizer. This graph shows our examination of whether or not we can expect some carryover nitrogen that might be of some benefit to soybeans. Here, this data is the data we've already shown, which is the pre-sidedress nitrate test for the corn at B4 in 2019 in Milan. Clearly, you can see here again that we had a good accounting of the commercial nitrogen that we used, and some release, but not very much of the nitrogen in the litter that was applied. When this litter was transitioned to soybeans in the subsequent year, we would expect that some of that nitrogen would perhaps be released and might be a benefit for the soybeans, but we were not able to verify that there was any carryover nitrogen, perhaps because that was the first year that we had applied litter to these soils. So we'll be examining this treatment effect over the next several years to verify whether or not there is any benefit. Another benefit that we thought might be possible for litter applications is an improvement in cover crop performance. We did see some indication that that might actually occur at Milan. These are cover crop data for the spring of 2020. Cover crops that were established at the end of the corn growing season for 2019, and we can see that apparently we may have some release of nitrogen for these higher application rates of litter and a small improvement in dry biomass cover for the wheat that we did establish on these plots as a cover plot. So this is going to be one thing that we'll be collecting data for over the next several years to verify that this treatment effect is there. We did not see a difference at Spring Hill for this effect, but the soils at Spring Hill have received dairy manure in the past, so that may be having an effect in terms of the cover crop performance there. I'd like to change focus in this next plot. We're showing soil test results here. These are for the Milan experiment station 1 year after litter application for the 2019 corn crop. These soil samples were collected immediately before soybeans were planted on the plots, and you can see that clearly we did have release of phosphorus and potassium from the nitrogen that was applied. I'm not showing the potassium results here, only the phosphorus, but we had a clear and significant impact on soil phosphorus levels with the application of the litter. In fact, we went from a scenario where we're borderline low in our phosphorus concentrations for the positive control and the negative control to at our 3 and 4 ton rates, and even the 3 and 4 and 7 ton rates. We changed our soil test phosphorus levels up to the high category. So one of the benefits clearly in using litter is that we can have one application for corn cover the phosphorus and nitrogen requirements for 2 or perhaps even more crop years of corn and soybeans in rotation. It's not just the primary plant nutrients that we expect to enrich in soils with litter applications. In this graph here, again, this is the same soil test 1 year after litter application, collected at soybean planting for 2020. This is results here for zinc, and we can see that we clearly did have an impact in soil zinc concentrations with our increasing litter application rates. So one of the things that we can expect with litter is that we will be applying not just, for example, some nitrogen as a starter fertilizer for corn, and not just multi-year phosphorus and potassium application rates for the primary plant nutrients, but also application of some other nutrients, mineral nutrients in particular, that could be crop limiting. And those in particular are sulfur and zinc and copper and boron. And over the next several years, we're going to be trying to verify with our study whether or not we do see an impact on the crop available concentrations of these other nutrients, which is an added benefit and value for using litter to produce grain. Moving on from the soil test, this is a graph that examines the phosphorus removal, the crop removal in corn and soybean grain. On the axes, the y-axis, you can see we've got the amount of P2O5 that's removed in the harvest in pounds per acre. And for each treatment, we have the 2019 corn grain and the 2020 soybean grain crop removal rates for P2O5. And I'm focusing here mainly on the positive control because the positive control, of course, maximized yields for the corn. Phosphorus removal for the corn grain was 130 pounds of P2O5 per acre, and for the subsequent soybean crop was 50 pounds of P2O5 per acre, again for very good yields. So these are fairly high numbers, but you can see that the total is approximately 180 pounds of phosphorus for the rotation. Transitioning now to add some context to the 2019 and 20 corn plus soybean crop removal of phosphorus. This graph here presents the P2O5 in pounds per acre, and the dark bar is the crop removal and the light gray bar is the amount of phosphorus that's replaced. And you can see that if we're considering the addition of litter, somewhere around 3 to 5 tons an acre is going to be what should be used if we're seeking to replace the multi-year or full rotation removal rate of phosphorus. So 3 to 4 tons, perhaps 5 tons an acre, since our concentrations were fairly low in the litter that we used in 2019. It would take approximately 3 to 5 tons for most litter to replace the grain removal of P2O5 in a corn and soybean rotation across 2 years. To wrap things up for today's presentation, I've got some take-home messages. The type of poultry waste that's predominantly available for grain producers to use as a fertilizer in Tennessee is broiler litter. Broilers are meat chickens that are produced in barns where they're raised on bedding material, and that mixture of bedding and accumulated waste is what we refer to as litter. Typically tests as a 3-3-3 fertilizer. That's 60 pounds of nitrogen, P2O5 and K2O per ton as is. Typically what we see is about 45% of the nitrogen is available, not all of it. We do recommend that you seek an analysis for the litter, or you perform an analysis yourself for the litter that you purchase so that you'll have a better idea of the nutrient concentrations, and just as a means to help establish value for the litter. I hope I've demonstrated that there's significant quantities of litter available in important grain producing regions in Tennessee, particularly Northwest Tennessee and South Central Tennessee. I believe that a good strategy is to use litter as a good starter for corn in a corn and soybean rotation. Corn is ideal because we have split nitrogen applications for the corn. That lowers the in supply risk for litter, which, remember, the nitrogen is predominantly organic. It has to be broken down in the soil to become plant available for corn to use. And so the application at planting can also be surveyed with a pre-sidedress nitrate test, a 12-inch soil sample collected at row stage V4 for the corn, and you can use that to fine-tune the commercial nitrogen application rates at V6. The ideal rate appears to be approximately 3 tons per acre, but it could be as high as 4 or 5 tons an acre, no more. The 3 tons an acre provides 80 pounds of nitrogen per acre, roughly, and 180 pounds of P2O5 and K2O.
That's plenty of starter nitrogen fertilizer, even for high-yielding cornfields, and it provides at least 2 years and probably more of phosphorus and potassium removal for a corn and soybean rotation. Lastly, we have clear evidence that litter provides a broad array of mineral nutrients, and we did show data for the zinc, but we also have data accumulating to show that litter may provide plant-available sulfur, boron, and copper.
I very much appreciate your attention today. I'd like to just reiterate that this research that I presented today is made possible by grants from the Tennessee Soybean Promotion Board and Tyson Foods. We were fortunate enough in early January of 2021 to also have funding from the Corn Promotion Board, and in that case we'll be conducting additional experiments focusing on continuous corn. If you have any questions about the presentation, please don't hesitate to give me a call. I've got my email address here, and this is my cell phone number. You can call this number at any time if you have questions, 865-207-7156. Thank you.